The air was heavy with the scent of salt and smoke on a humid afternoon in late 1945. A group of Japanese women stood inside a barbed wire compound on the outskirts of Manila, their khaki uniforms faded, their hair unkempt from months of captivity. Once nurses, clerks, and auxiliaries of the Imperial Japanese Army, they now watched in silence as an extraordinary sight unfolded before them. Just beyond the wire fence, a group of American soldiers were laughing with Japanese male prisoners. The sound felt almost alien, echoing through the stillness of defeat. The women blinked in disbelief. They had been told the Americans were demons, brutal, merciless conquerors who would dishonor them or kill them. Yet here they were, sharing cigarettes, tossing a baseball, even patting their prisoners on the back. One American offered a can of coffee to a weary Japanese sergeant who hesitated, then nodded in quiet thanks. The women exchanged uncertain glances. The world they had been taught to believe in was breaking apart, not with gunfire or explosion, but with laughter. The war in the Pacific had ended only months earlier, but for thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians scattered across the islands, surrender did not come with peace. In the remnants of the empire's shattered outposts, from the jungles of Luzon to the scorched beaches of Okinawa, survivors were still grappling with disbelief. Japan's defeat had not only destroyed a nation, it had unraveled an entire belief system. For the women of the Imperial Japanese Army, this collapse of ideology was especially profound. They had been raised in a world where loyalty to the emperor was sacred, where obedience was a moral law, and where surrender was not only shameful, but unthinkable. These women, nurses, clerks, and support staff, were taught that capture by the enemy meant dishonor worse than death. Their duty was to serve, to sacrifice, and, if necessary, to die. And yet, here they were, alive behind Allied barbed wire, confronting a reality their nation had promised would never exist. In the years leading up to World War II, Japan had transformed itself into a militarized society under the banner of nationalism and divine destiny. The 1930s brought a wave of state propaganda that glorified self-sacrifice and condemned weakness. Schoolgirls learned songs about dying for the emperor. Mothers were told that their greatest duty was to raise sons who would not fear death. When war came to the Pacific in 1941, this ideology extended to women who joined the military. The Women's Volunteer Corps and Imperial Army Nursing Service were created to support frontline operations. Many of these women were sent to the Philippines, Singapore, or the Dutch East Indies, where they worked under extreme conditions, tending to the wounded, managing logistics, or serving as communication staff. They lived under strict military codes, often indoctrinated to believe that capture meant a fate worse than death. Stories spread among them of Allied cruelty, tales of mutilation, assault, and humiliation, exaggerated to ensure loyalty and obedience. They were told never to show weakness, never to trust, and above all, never to believe in the enemy's humanity. But the final years of the war brought that illusion crashing down. As Japan's defensive lines collapsed, entire garrisons were cut off and surrounded. By late 1944, when the Philippines campaign began, many female personnel were trapped alongside male soldiers in isolated outposts. The American advance was relentless: Leyte, Mindoro, then Luzon. For the Japanese, the order was clear: fight to the last man, the last bullet, the last breath. Yet hunger, disease, and exhaustion broke even the strongest resolve. Thousands surrendered, often after their commanding officers took their own lives. Among the prisoners were dozens of women, nurses, clerks, and typists, who had no means of escape. They braced themselves for what they had been taught to expect: brutality, torture, or worse. When American soldiers discovered the first groups of Japanese women prisoners, what followed defied every expectation. Instead of the vengeance they feared, they found order, discipline, and, astonishingly, kindness. The U.S. Army followed the Geneva Convention protocols, extending POW protections even to enemy personnel who had not formally been recognized under international law. Camps were established where prisoners received medical care, food, and humane treatment. For the Japanese women, this was incomprehensible. They had been told that Americans were monsters who would defile and destroy them. Instead, they were given blankets, rice, and medical attention. One U.S. report from the Philippines noted the astonishment of captured Japanese nurses when they were offered clean water and soap. They stood motionless, unsure if it was a trick. Only after a sergeant demonstrated washing his own hands did they follow. Behind the razor wire, daily routines began to form. Meals were distributed, medical checks conducted, and for the first time in years, some of these women felt physically safe. But mentally, the conflict continued. How could their captors, the same men who had bombed Tokyo and burned Hiroshima, now treat them with such civility? To them, it felt like a humiliation disguised as mercy. They struggled to reconcile their national pride with their new reality, a life spared by those they were raised to hate. Allied guards noticed this tension. Reports from camp administrators described Japanese women as disciplined, reserved, and emotionally detached, rarely speaking or accepting comfort. Yet over time, their silence began to soften. Part of what made this transformation so striking was the atmosphere inside the American-run camps. Unlike the harsh prisoner compounds of Imperial Japan, these places carried a sense of structured decency. Prisoners were not beaten for mistakes. They were corrected. When someone fell ill, they were treated. American medics treated Japanese women with the same professionalism as they did their own wounded. The Japanese women observed with quiet disbelief how the guards laughed with one another, sometimes even joking with Japanese male prisoners who worked in the kitchens or on repairs. The sound of laughter, so ordinary to the Americans, struck these women like thunder. In their culture of war, laughter in captivity was unimaginable. To laugh in defeat was shameful. To share humor with the enemy was treachery, and yet it was happening all around them. The contrast between indoctrination and reality grew sharper each day. The Japanese military had painted Americans as savages without honor or restraint, but the women saw something different, a kind of moral confidence. The guards seemed at ease, not cruel but composed, certain of their victory not only through force but through principle. For the Japanese women, it was not just the defeat of their army they were witnessing. It was the defeat of their worldview. To see an enemy laugh freely while you trembled in silence was a form of disorientation no military manual could prepare them for. Still, within the camp, remnants of imperial discipline lingered. The women saluted one another, kept their quarters immaculate, and observed ritual decorum during meals. Some refused to speak to the guards. Others began cautiously to ask questions about the war, about America, about freedom. One nurse captured in Luzon later recounted in an Allied report that she could not understand how Americans treated Japanese soldiers with respect after such a brutal conflict. "They are kind to those they fought," she said, "and that frightens me more than their weapons." While the Japanese government had long ignored the Geneva Conventions, the Americans held firm to them, believing that moral consistency was as vital as military victory. The humane treatment of prisoners was more than just policy. It was propaganda in its own right. American commanders understood that every captured Japanese soldier or nurse who survived and returned home would carry a story that could reshape Japan's perception of the United States. That strategy worked. By treating even their bitterest enemies with restraint and decency, they planted the first seeds of post-war reconciliation. Outside the camps, the world was changing just as rapidly. Japan lay in ruins, its cities reduced to ashes. The emperor's surrender had shattered the myth of divine infallibility. Millions of civilians were displaced, hungry, and traumatized. But within the confines of the POW compounds, a different kind of revolution was unfolding. One not fought with weapons, but with gestures, tone, and behavior. The Japanese women, once symbols of imperial loyalty, were witnessing the moral code of their conquerors. Each act of compassion contradicted years of indoctrination, and yet the disbelief persisted. They could not understand how laughter could exist after such devastation. To them, laughter belonged to peace, not to victory. But for the Americans, it was a sign of normalcy, the resilience of men who had endured the unimaginable and still found room for humanity. That laughter, echoing across the compound fences, would become one of the most disarming weapons of post-war psychology. By the end of 1945, most of these women no longer feared for their lives. What they feared instead was their return home, to a country that had lost everything, and to a society that might reject them for surviving. The Americans, unaware of the depth of this internal conflict, simply carried on with their routines. They did not know that their small acts of kindness, a smile, a shared joke, a ration of sugar, were reshaping the minds of their former enemies in ways no bomb ever could. The quiet revolution of perception had begun, and it started not with surrender on a battlefield, but with something as human and unguarded as laughter. In the weeks following their capture, the Japanese women found themselves trapped between two worlds, the one they had been taught to die for, and the one they were now forced to live in. Inside the camp, order was maintained through structure, not punishment. Guards kept schedules, food lines were calm, and the women were given simple tasks: cleaning, sewing, or assisting in the infirmary. To the Americans, it was routine discipline. To the Japanese women, it was disorienting compassion. The power dynamic was clear, but it lacked cruelty. No shouts, no beatings, no humiliation. Instead, there was an unfamiliar tone, one of quiet efficiency and strange respect. The American guards addressed prisoners with calm voices, sometimes even using humor to ease tension. What shocked the Japanese most was not the leniency, but the equality. They saw soldiers and officers laughing together, teasing one another without fear. For a people raised under rigid hierarchy and emotional restraint, this was a form of freedom they had never known. The cultural gap between captor and captive became a living lesson in contrasting civilizations. Japan had built its war machine on discipline, sacrifice, and devotion to the emperor. Emotion was a weakness, laughter a distraction from duty. Every act in wartime Japan was ritualized, from saluting the flag to dying in battle. By comparison, the Americans seemed undisciplined at first glance, even irreverent. They joked, they sang. They called each other by nicknames. But the Japanese women soon realized that beneath that informality was a different kind of strength. One born not from fear of authority, but from confidence in shared principles. American soldiers obeyed their officers not out of blind worship, but because they believed in the purpose of their mission. It was a unity rooted in choice, not obligation. Many of the women who had served in the Imperial Army had been educated under a doctrine that worshipped death as virtue. Their textbooks taught them that dying for the emperor was the purest act of loyalty. They were warned that Allied soldiers were beasts, lawless men who destroyed, defiled, and desecrated. But captivity showed them a different truth. Instead of monsters, they saw men who treated prisoners as human beings. They saw doctors tending to Japanese wounds with care. They saw officers who shared their rations, who smiled and spoke gently. It was not mercy that shocked them, it was normalcy. They had expected barbarity. They found order. They had expected vengeance. They found discipline. In one of the camps in Luzon, a young Japanese nurse who had served during the Lady Campaign later recalled in an Allied report how she couldn't comprehend the Americans' attitude toward prisoners. She described an afternoon when an American medic helped carry an injured Japanese soldier to a cot, then offered him a cigarette. He thanked him, she said, and the American smiled. It was a smile without hatred. I thought it impossible. For her and many others, this simple moment challenged years of indoctrination. They began to question everything, their leaders, their education, even the nature of honor itself. The American soldiers, for their part, were not philosophers or moral strategists. They were simply following protocol, the Geneva Conventions, the code of conduct instilled by their officers. But unknowingly, they were waging a different kind of war, a moral and psychological one. Every humane gesture, every instance of laughter or fairness eroded the enemy's propaganda. In the silence of captivity, that realization began to take root among the Japanese women. They observed how the guards joked with prisoners from Germany or Italy, treating them with the same impartiality. There was no favoritism, no racial superiority flaunted. To the Americans, all prisoners were simply that, prisoners of war, not subhuman enemies. The Japanese, whose ideology was built on racial hierarchy, found this deeply confusing. What the women could not have known was that this behavior was partly deliberate. American command understood that psychological victory was as vital as military triumph. Treating the enemy well was a weapon of influence. It sent a message to those who would one day rebuild Japan, that the United States did not conquer for cruelty but to restore order. The strategy was subtle but powerful. The laughter echoing through those camps was not only a symbol of ease, it was a declaration of moral confidence. The victors could afford to be kind because they had nothing to fear. The moment of reckoning came not on a battlefield, but under the flickering light of an oil lamp in a captured field hospital near Remagen, in March 1945. The Rhine lay only a few miles away, its bridges crumbling under Allied bombardment, its waters reflecting the collapse of the Reich. Inside the hospital, the sound of boots and stretchers replaced the thunder of artillery. The war outside had turned into a flood of wounded men, German and American side by side, indistinguishable beneath torn uniforms and blood-soaked bandages. The nurses, both German and American, worked shoulder to shoulder, their hands shaking not from fear but exhaustion. They no longer had time to hate. Among them was a young German Red Cross nurse named Liesel, barely 23, who had served since 1942. She had tended to wounded on the Eastern Front, where mercy had been forbidden. She had watched Soviet prisoners left to die in snowbanks, their pleas ignored under orders. Now, in this new world of surrender, she found herself assisting an American surgeon, Captain Edward Hall, in treating a line of wounded that never seemed to end. Her duty was simple: hand instruments, clean wounds, change dressings. But what she witnessed during those long hours defied everything she had been taught. One stretcher was brought in carrying 2 soldiers, one German, one American, both unconscious. Hall glanced at both and gestured toward the German. "He's worse," he said quietly. The nurse hesitated. "But she couldn't finish. Hall cut her off. "He's human. That's what matters." His tone was steady, not scolding. He bent over the German soldier, opened his chest wound, and began suturing with precision born of habit, not hatred. The American soldier lay beside him, waiting his turn without complaint. The other medics followed his example without question. It was a scene almost unthinkable months earlier. An American saving a German life before his own, and a German nurse assisting without objection. As the hours stretched into night, the boundaries between captor and captive dissolved. The American staff called the German nurses Miss instead of Fräulein. They shared rations and coffee and sometimes even laughter, a sound that seemed indecent amid the suffering, yet strangely healing. For the German women, it was disorienting. Laughter had been absent in their hospitals. Discipline had replaced warmth. Here, the Americans joked softly even as they worked, their humor carrying a quiet defiance against despair. The turning point came when a group of German SS officers, wounded and newly captured, were brought in under guard. Their black uniforms still bore insignia that symbolized cruelty, conquest, and fear. The German nurses stiffened. Some lowered their heads. These were men they had once treated with reverence. Now they arrived defeated, trembling, their arrogance stripped away. The American medics did not flinch. They treated them like any other patient. A sergeant with a shattered leg received a morphine shot. Another, pale and shaking, was given water. When one tried to refuse treatment from an American nurse, muttering in shame, she replied softly, "Then die if you wish." "But I will still do my duty." The German nurses exchanged glances. The balance of power, of morality, had inverted completely. The enemy they had feared now embodied the very discipline, compassion, and strength their own side had claimed to represent. One of the German women wept silently as she cleaned the wound of an SS officer who had once ordered the execution of captured medics on the Eastern Front. She said nothing, only worked. For her, it was penance. For the Americans, it was procedure. The hospital became a microcosm of the entire war's end, a place where humanity struggled to reassert itself amid the ruins of ideology. Outside, the Allies were crossing the Rhine. Inside, the Germans were crossing a different river, one of conscience. Each act of mercy carried symbolic weight. When an American medic covered a dying German's body with a blanket, a German nurse whispered, "We were told you were monsters." The medic, not looking up, simply said, "Monsters don't bother with blankets." That night, the generator failed, plunging the ward into darkness. The nurses lit lanterns and candles, their flames reflecting off surgical tools like stars over a battlefield. In the faint light, faces blurred, nationality vanished. The groans of the dying spoke one universal language. A German nurse found herself tending to an American private who had lost his arm. He was delirious, mumbling fragments of a song. She didn't know the words, but she hummed along, her voice trembling. For the first time in her life, she was caring for someone she had once been trained to despise, and realizing that compassion required no permission. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and soundless. The war was ending, but in those hours another kind of peace began. When morning came, the hospital floor was littered with bloody bandages, coffee cups, and exhaustion. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The German nurses no longer stood apart from their American counterparts. They worked together without orders. When Captain Hall thanked them at dawn, he didn't speak as a victor. "You did good work," he said. It was the first time many of them had ever been praised without condition. Days later, news spread through the camp. The bridge at Remagen had held. The Allies were crossing into Germany. For the German nurses, that news meant two things: the end of their world and the beginning of another they barely understood. But they also carried with them a memory that defied the propaganda of the past. A moment when they had seen strength and mercy coexist, when their enemies had taught them the meaning of dignity. One nurse later recalled in her post-war testimony, "When I saw the Americans treat our wounded before their own, I felt my knees weaken. Not from fear, but from shame. I realized then that we had lost more than the war. We had lost our humanity long before." That single realization, repeated across dozens of captured hospitals and aid stations, marked the true turning point. It wasn't the fall of Berlin or the collapse of command. It was the quiet rediscovery of conscience. The American medics didn't see themselves as moral crusaders. They were simply doing their job. But to those who watched, their actions were revolutionary. The war continued to rage beyond those tents and basements. But for the German women who witnessed that night in Remagen, the world had already changed. The myth of superiority had died beside the wounded, and something else, fragile yet eternal, had been born in its place. When the ships carrying the Japanese women POWs docked at Yokohama in mid-1946, the sky was gray, the harbor littered with wreckage, and the air smelled faintly of burnt oil and ash. Japan no longer looked like the nation they had left. The proud banners of the rising sun were gone, replaced by American flags fluttering from the ships of the occupying forces. The streets were hollow with defeat, buildings gutted by firebombing, faces gaunt with hunger. To the returning women, it felt as though they were stepping into a different world, one not ruled by the emperor's will but by survival itself. For months, they had been prisoners in an American-run camp where food, safety, and dignity were given freely. Now, as free women in their homeland, they saw freedom stripped away from an entire nation. The contrast was unbearable. The people who greeted them on the docks did not cheer or welcome them as survivors. Instead, there were whispers, murmurs of shame. Captivity was not an honor in Imperial Japan. It was a mark of disgrace. For generations, surrender had been considered a crime against loyalty, an unforgivable betrayal. Many of the women could not look their families in the eye. They had survived, yes, but in doing so, they had broken the code of their culture. In their hearts, they carried the weight of a paradox. They had found humanity among their enemies and silence among their own. The American occupation authorities, under General Douglas MacArthur, were already reshaping Japan into a democratic society. Censorship was lifted, women were granted the right to vote, and education was being reformed to erase the militarism that had once defined the nation. Yet in homes across the country, the wounds of ideology lingered. The returning women POWs were living proof of a truth most Japanese citizens still struggled to accept, that the enemy they had been taught to despise had acted with decency and restraint. Few dared to speak openly about it, but those who did were often met with disbelief. "The Americans treated you kindly?" Neighbors would ask. "You must be mistaken," but they were not mistaken. They remembered the laughter in the camps, the fairness of the guards, the way American nurses and soldiers spoke without fear. They remembered the shock of seeing women in uniforms who were respected by men, who could drive trucks, handle radios, or lead field operations without shame or subordination. For the Japanese women who had been raised in a system that demanded silence and submission, that memory was both inspiring and painful. It revealed everything their nation had denied them: dignity, independence, equality. Over time, the occupation brought those same values into Japan itself. In 1947, the new Japanese constitution was enacted, enshrining principles of democracy, gender equality, and human rights. Women who had never imagined a voice in politics were now voters, teachers, and administrators. The Japanese women who had once been POWs watched this transformation unfold with quiet wonder. For them, it was as though the world they had glimpsed behind barbed wire, a world of fairness and laughter, was now emerging across their homeland. Yet the transformation was not without pain. Many of these women carried deep guilt for surviving when others had died. They had seen the horrors of war firsthand, the starvation, the bombing, the despair. Some could not reconcile the kindness of the Americans with the destruction they had unleashed upon Japan. They had lost families to air raids, homes to fire, and yet the very people responsible for that destruction had also shown them mercy. It was a contradiction that haunted them. In small post-war communities, especially among those who had served in the military, secrecy became a shield. Few women spoke openly of their captivity. The social stigma was too strong. To admit survival through capture was to confess weakness. Yet within private circles, nursing associations, veterans' reunions, and small local gatherings, they began to share stories. And in those stories, a pattern emerged, not one of humiliation, but of awakening. They spoke of learning from their captors, of discovering that strength could exist without cruelty, and that respect could be given freely, not enforced through fear. One former nurse who had served in Manila later gave a testimony to an occupation researcher. She recalled how she had once believed that laughter among soldiers was dishonor, but that the Americans had taught her differently. They laughed even when they lost friends, she said. It was not weakness. It was courage. It meant life was still worth living. Those words echoed the essence of what so many of them had learned, that the power of a nation was not in its silence or sacrifice, but in its humanity. By the early 1950s, Japan's cities began to rebuild. Factories reopened, schools flourished, and American cultural influence spread rapidly through films, fashion, and music. In this new world, laughter once again became part of daily life, in schools, offices, and homes. For the generation of women who had lived through the war, it was both strange and beautiful. They had been told laughter belonged to the weak. Now it had become a symbol of peace. Some of the former POWs took positions in hospitals and education, carrying with them the values they had learned from their captors. They taught younger nurses not only discipline but compassion. They encouraged curiosity, kindness, and the belief that dignity could coexist with humility. They never forgot the small acts of humanity that had reshaped their understanding of the enemy. A shared cigarette, a clean bandage, a word of comfort in a foreign tongue. Those moments became the silent foundation of a new Japan, one that could look outward instead of inward, one that could rebuild not through vengeance, but through empathy. Still, there were those who never fully healed. Some women lived the rest of their lives in quiet obscurity, burdened by the memories of defeat. They did not see themselves as symbols of peace, only as survivors of confusion. The contradictions of their experiences, the laughter of Americans contrasted against the silence of their homeland, remained unresolved. But history has a way of softening the edges of guilt. Decades later, historians and journalists would rediscover their stories, bringing to light the forgotten truth that humanity can persist even in captivity. Their testimony helped bridge two nations once divided by hatred. In the 1960s, as Japan and the United States became allies, the memory of those camps took on new meaning. It became proof that compassion could outlast ideology, that understanding could grow from the ruins of war. When Japanese nurses began traveling to the U.S. for exchange programs and training, many cited a quiet admiration for the professionalism and equality of their American counterparts, the same qualities they had first witnessed decades earlier behind barbed wire. For the women who had lived it, that memory was both humbling and redemptive. They no longer saw the Americans as conquerors nor themselves as victims. They saw humanity on both sides, fragile, flawed, but enduring. The laughter that had once unsettled them now lived in their own lives, in the small joys of post-war existence. A laugh at a market, a smile shared between nurses, a moment of humor in hardship. These were echoes of a freedom they had once only witnessed from behind a fence. In the end, the war had stripped everything from them, rank, pride, belief. But in its aftermath, they had gained something no ideology could ever give, the understanding that mercy is stronger than fear. Their captivity, once a symbol of shame, had become a hidden chapter of rebirth, and for them and for Japan itself. And yet, Beneath that rebirth lingered the memory of the day they had first heard laughter ring across the camp. That moment, simple and human, had changed the course of their lives, and in a quiet way, the course of their nation. It was proof that victory did not need cruelty, and that the greatest strength a people could possess was not the power to destroy, but the courage to forgive. In the years that followed, the war faded into textbooks, but for the women who had lived through it, who had stood behind wire and watched their captors laugh, the memories never left. They carried them quietly like photographs in the mind, not of violence or hatred, but of faces. American medics tending wounds, guards sharing food, nurses smiling under tropical light. For these Japanese women, captivity had not been a lesson in defeat. It had been a revelation about humanity itself. They had been raised to believe that war erased compassion, that mercy was weakness, that to surrender was shame. Yet in the unlikeliest of places, among the very soldiers who had bombed their cities, they discovered the opposite. Mercy was not weakness, and it was power. It was the power to remain human when everything else demanded hatred. The laughter they once feared became a sound they longed for, the sound of peace, the sound of men and women who had refused to let war define their souls. As Japan rose from the ashes, becoming a symbol of recovery and progress, the lessons those women carried lived on even unspoken. They were reminders that empathy could survive even the darkest age, that enemies could become teachers, and that understanding could grow from the ruins of pride. History would record battles, numbers, and treaties, but it would forget these small, fragile moments of grace. And yet, those were the moments that truly ended the war in human hearts. In the end, what the Japanese women POWs witnessed was not merely the power of victory, but the power of decency. The Americans had conquered without cruelty, laughed without arrogance, and shown that even in war, the truest triumph belongs to those who do not lose their humanity. That truth, quiet and enduring, became their final memory of the war, a whisper of laughter carried on the wind long after the guns had fallen silent.